What if everything you've ever been taught about the origin of human civilization is only the final chapter of a much longer story? What if history didn't begin 6,000 years ago, but stretches back hundreds of thousands of years into a forgotten past? And what if the evidence of that past has been sitting quietly, etched into clay tablets, waiting to be noticed? Take a slow breath. Let your mind settle. Tonight, we're not rushing toward answers. We're drifting, gently, into one of the deepest mysteries of human history. Somewhere beneath the sands of ancient Mesopotamia, in what is now modern-day Iraq, archaeologists uncovered thousands of clay tablets. Small, fragile, covered in wedge-shaped symbols. This writing system, known as cuneiform, is one of the oldest ever created. These tablets belong to the Sumerians. According to mainstream history, the Sumerians were the first civilization, the first cities, the first writing, the first structured society. Everything begins with them, around 6,000 years ago. But there's a problem, because when researchers began translating these tablets, they found something unexpected. The Sumerians were not writing about their beginning. They were writing about something far older. Stories of kings, dynasties, entire eras, stretching back not thousands, but hundreds of thousands of years. 400,000 years. Let that number sink in. 400,000 years of recorded history, described by a civilization we're told had just emerged from primitive conditions. It doesn't fit. It doesn't align with anything we've been taught. And yet, the records exist. The Sumerians didn't claim to invent civilization. They said it was given to them, passed down from beings they described as gods, teachers, rulers from a time before time. And they kept records, careful, structured, deliberate records of kings who ruled before a great catastrophe, a flood, a reset, a moment when everything was washed away. And after that moment, history begins again, but slower, smaller, shorter, as if something had been lost. Now, as you listen, there's no need to decide what is true. Just allow the ideas to unfold, one by one, like fragments of a memory returning. Because in the next part, we'll begin to look closer at the Sumerians themselves, who they were, where they came from, and why. They appeared in history already knowing everything, as if they were remembering rather than discovering. The official version of history tells us something very simple. The Sumerians appeared, almost suddenly, in the fertile lands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a region later called Mesopotamia, a place rich with water, soft soil, and the potential for agriculture. It sounds reasonable. Civilization began where conditions allowed it. But when we look closer, something doesn't quite feel right. Because the Sumerians didn't develop slowly. They didn't spend thousands of years figuring things out step by step. They arrived, already complete. Cities appeared, not villages evolving into towns, but fully structured urban centers, with walls, with planning, with districts. They had writing, not primitive markings, but a complex system capable of recording trade, law, astronomy, and myth. They had mathematics, based on the number 60. A system so precise, we still use it today to measure time and angles. They had astronomy, mapping the movements of celestial bodies with surprising accuracy. They had law, governance, architecture, irrigation systems that controlled entire rivers. All of it already there, as if they hadn't invented it, but inherited it. Take a moment and let that thought settle. Because in most parts of the world, human development follows a pattern. Simple tools, gradual improvements, trial and error. But here, in Sumer, we see something else entirely. A jump, a leap, with no visible transition. Historians often explain this by pointing to favorable conditions: a good climate, abundant water, fertile land. But those same conditions existed in many other places on Earth. And yet, civilization didn't appear there in the same way. Not like this. Not all at once. And then, there are the Sumerians themselves. Because when they wrote about their origins, they didn't describe discovery. They described transmission. They said their knowledge came from the gods, from beings who ruled before them, who brought order to the world, who taught them everything, from writing to agriculture to the movements of the stars. And perhaps most interesting of all, they didn't question it. To them, it wasn't mythology. It was memory. A record of something that had already happened. And so instead of asking, how did we invent civilization? The Sumerians asked a very different question. Who had it before us? In the next part, we'll look directly at the records they left behind. The king lists, names, numbers, timelines that stretch far beyond anything we consider possible. And as we begin to read them, you may start to notice something unusual. Not chaos, not fantasy, but structure. A pattern, hidden inside impossible numbers. Now, let's slow down even more and look directly at the text itself. Not interpretations, not theories, just what was written. Among the thousands of clay tablets discovered in Mesopotamia, there is one group of texts that stands apart. Historians call them the Sumerian King List. At first glance, it seems simple. A list of rulers, names, cities, and the length of their reigns. Something many ancient cultures recorded. But this list begins in a very unusual way. Not with the first human king, not with the founding of a city, but with a sentence that feels almost out of place. When kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Take a moment with that. Kingship did not begin on Earth. It descended from somewhere else. And it began in a city called Eridu. Archaeologists agree that Eridu is one of the oldest known settlements in human history. But according to this list, its origins go much deeper than we can measure, because the first king of Eridu was named Alulim. And according to the text, he ruled for 28,800 years. After him came another king, Alalgar. He ruled for 36,000 years. Not decades, not centuries, but tens of thousands of years, for a single reign. At this point, most modern interpretations stop. They label it as myth, exaggeration, symbolism, and move on. But let's not move on just yet. Let's stay here a little longer, because the pattern continues. After Eridu, kingship moves to another city, Bad Tibera. There, 3 kings rule, for a total of 108,000 years. Then it moves again, to Larak, then Sippar, then Shuruppak. 5 cities, 8 kings, a continuous line of rulership, lasting 241,200 years, all before a single event, a sudden, final interruption. The text describes it in just a few words. The flood swept over. That's it. No long explanation, no dramatic detail, just a quiet, absolute ending. Everything before it, gone. Now here's where it becomes even more interesting, because after the flood, the list continues. Kingship returns. New rulers appear. But something has changed. The numbers. Instead of tens of thousands of years, the reigns become shorter. Hundreds. Then decades. Then something much closer to what we would expect from human history. It's not random. It's gradual. A steady decline from something immense to something familiar. And this raises a question that's difficult to ignore. If these numbers were purely invented, why structure them this way? Why create a clear divide between a distant past of impossibly long reigns and a more recent past that begins to resemble reality? Why not make everything equally exaggerated or equally realistic? Instead, what we see is a transition, almost as if the text is describing 2 different eras, 2 different conditions, 2 different kinds of existence, and between them, a single event, the flood. In the next part, we'll begin to look at those numbers more closely, because hidden inside them is a mathematical structure that may suggest they were never meant to be taken at face value, but as something else entirely. Let's stay with the numbers just a little longer, because at first glance, they feel impossible, almost artificial. Numbers so large that they seem to belong more to myth than to any structured attempt at recording reality. 28,000 years. 36,000. Over 100,000 years assigned to entire periods of rule. The natural reaction is to dismiss them. But instead of rejecting them, let's slow down. Because sometimes, when something looks irrational, it's not because it lacks meaning, but because we're reading it the wrong way. So let's shift perspective. Not, what do these numbers say? But, how are these numbers built? Because when researchers began examining the structure of the Sumerian king list more carefully, a pattern emerged, a precise one. Almost every single reign in the pre-flood section is divisible by the same number, 3,600. Again and again, across different kings, across different cities, the same numerical base repeats. 28,800 is exactly 8 times 3,600. 36,000 is exactly 10 times 3,600. Even the total duration, 241,200, fits cleanly into this structure. This is not randomness. This is design. And that changes everything. Because in Sumerian culture, 3,600 was not just a number, it was a unit, a cycle. They called it a sar. And to understand what that means, we need to step into a different way of thinking. Because the Sumerians did not count like we do. Their entire mathematical system was built on the number 60, a base 60 system, which might feel strange until you realize we still use it today. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle, fragments of that ancient system, still shaping how we measure reality. Quietly, invisibly. So when the Sumerians wrote numbers, they weren't just counting years. They were working within a system of cycles, nested intervals, patterns within patterns. And that raises a question. What if a tsar was never meant to represent literal years at all? What if it was something else? Because when we begin to experiment with that idea, something interesting happens. If we take 3,600 not as years, but as days, the scale changes dramatically. 3,600 days is just under 10 years. And suddenly, 28,800 becomes about 80 years. 36,000 becomes about 100 years. Numbers that feel familiar, human, possible. But even this may not be the full picture, because there's another layer, deeper, slower, almost invisible. Astronomical time. There is a movement of the Earth, so subtle, so gradual, that it escapes ordinary perception. The axis of the Earth slowly wobbles, a cycle known as precession. It takes roughly 25,800 years to complete a full rotation. Too slow for a single lifetime, but not too slow for a civilization that observes the sky over generations. And here's where something remarkable appears. The number 72. Across cultures, across continents, across entirely different mythological systems, 72 keeps returning. 72 years is the time it takes for the stars to shift by 1 degree due to precession. Multiply 72 by 50, and you get 3,600. A SAR. Now pause there, because this suggests something very different from primitive record keeping. It suggests awareness, observation, a connection between time and the movement of the cosmos. And if that's true, then the numbers in the king list are not exaggerations. They are encoded, compressed, translated into a system we no longer fully understand. Which means we might not be looking at impossible lifespans at all, but at a timeline, a structured memory of something vast, measured not in human years, but in cycles of the Earth itself. And if that idea is even partially true, then the past described by the Sumerians is not just older than we thought. It is deeper, slower, almost geological in scale. And now, with that in mind, we return to the moment that divides everything. A single line in the text. Simple, final, unavoidable. The flood swept over. In the next part, we'll move into that moment. Not as myth, but as an event that may have left traces across the entire planet. Let's return to that moment. Not as a story, not as mythology, but as a dividing line. Because everything in the Sumerian king list changes here. Before the flood, time stretches into vast, almost incomprehensible cycles. After the flood, it contracts, stabilizes, becomes something we recognize. And between those two worlds, there is only one sentence. The flood swept over. No details, no description, no drama. Just an ending. And that silence is important, because it doesn't read like a legend. It reads like something already known. Something that didn't need explanation. As if anyone reading it at the time already understood what that meant. Now take a slow breath Because this is where the story begins to expand, far beyond Mesopotamia. Because the Sumerians were not the only ones who remembered a flood. Across the world, in cultures separated by oceans, languages, and thousands of years, the same story appears, again and again. In ancient Mesopotamia, a man is warned by a god to build a vessel and survive the coming destruction. In later Akkadian texts, his name becomes Utnapishtim. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, he tells of a flood so vast, it erased the world. In the Hebrew tradition, the story becomes Noah, a chosen man, a constructed ark, animals preserved, waters rising, a mountain landing. In India, the figure is Manu, warned by a mysterious being, guided through the flood, tasked with preserving life. In Greece, Deucalion and Pyrrha survive a deluge sent by the gods. In the Americas, among the Maya, the Aztecs, and the Hopi, there are stories of previous worlds destroyed by water. In China, ancient texts speak of great floods that reshaped the land and forced humanity to rebuild. Different names, different details, but the same structure. A world, a catastrophe, a few survivors, and a beginning, after everything ends. Now, let that pattern settle in your mind, because one story can be dismissed, two can be coincidence, but dozens, across the planet, begin to form something else. A memory. Fragmented. Distorted. But persistent. And here's where science begins to whisper something similar. Because at the end of the last ice age, something happened. Around 11,000 to 12,000 years ago. The Earth entered a period of rapid and dramatic change. Massive Lednikovy Shiti, covering much of the northern hemisphere, began to melt. Not slowly, but in pulses. Sudden releases of water pouring into the oceans, raising sea levels, not over millennia, but sometimes within centuries, even decades. Entire coastlines disappeared. Plains became seabeds. Rivers changed course. And for the people living in those regions, it would not feel like gradual change. It would feel like the world ending. Imagine it. Settlements near the coast, slowly watching the water rise, year after year, fields turning into marsh, villages abandoned, and then, at some point, a surge, a collapse, a wall of water, moving inland. No time to adapt, no time to prepare, just movement, escape, survival. Now imagine being one of the few who made it through. You lose everything, your land, your home, your past. But you remember, and you tell the story to your children, and they tell it again and again, until thousands of years later, it becomes myth. But underneath that myth, there is something real. And now we return to the Sumerians, because their text doesn't just describe a flood, it places it at a very specific point, between two worlds. Before it, something ancient. After it, something new, which leads to a quiet but powerful idea. What if the flood was not just a story? What if it was a reset, not of the entire planet, but of something else? Something more fragile. Civilization. In the next part, we'll move away from texts and into the earth itself, because the ground beneath us still carries the memory of what the water once erased. Now, let's leave the tablets for a moment and turn our attention to something that doesn't tell stories, something that does not imagine or exaggerate the Earth itself. Because unlike human memory, the planet remembers everything, in layers, in stone, in ice, in sediment buried deep beneath our feet. And when scientists began studying those layers closely, they found something unexpected. Not a smooth, gradual history, but a series of disruptions. Moments where everything changed, abruptly, violently. Around 20,000 years ago, the Earth was in the grip of the last ice age. Vast Lednikovy Shiti covered North America, Northern Europe, and parts of Asia. Sea levels were much lower, by as much as 120 meters, which means something very important. Huge areas of land that are now underwater were once dry, coastal plains, river valleys, habitable regions, where people could live, where they would live, because even today, human populations concentrate near water. Coasts, rivers, fertile land. Now imagine that world. A different map, a different geography, entire regions that no longer exist. And then, the ice begins to melt, but not gently, not evenly. Scientists call them meltwater pulses, sudden releases of enormous volumes of water, raising sea levels rapidly, sometimes several meters within a single century. To us, that sounds slow, but for a human life, it is catastrophic. It means watching the horizon move year after year, watching the ocean reclaim the land piece by piece, until one day, it takes everything. There is one period in particular that stands out. Around 11,600 years ago, a time known as the Younger Dryas Transition. Before it, the Earth was warming. Then suddenly, temperatures dropped again. A brief return to cold. And then, an even more rapid warming followed. Within a relatively short span of time, the climate shifted dramatically. Ecosystems collapsed. Ice melted at accelerated rates. Sea levels surged. And across the geological record, we find traces of chaos. Burn layers, microscopic spheres of melted material, nanodiamonds, evidence that some researchers believe could point to a cosmic impact, a comet, or fragments of one, striking or exploding over the ice sheets, releasing unimaginable energy, triggering fires, floods, atmospheric disruption. It's still debated, still controversial. But the evidence is there, and regardless of the exact cause, the result is clear. The end of the Ice Age was not calm, it was unstable, violent, transformative. Now, pause for a moment, because this is where two worlds begin to overlap. On one side, geology tells us there were floods, there were sudden changes, there were events capable of destroying entire regions. On the other side, ancient traditions tell us there was a flood, there was destruction, there was a world that ended. Different languages, different methods, but a similar message. And then, there's something even more intriguing, because around this same period, just after these dramatic changes, we begin to see something new appear in the archaeological record. The earliest signs of organized human culture, agriculture, settlements, ritual sites, as if, after the chaos, something began again. But here's the question that lingers. Did civilization begin here? for the first time? Or did it begin again? In the next part, we'll explore a possibility that feels almost inevitable. If rising oceans swallowed entire landscapes, then where would the evidence of any earlier civilization be? And what might still be hidden beneath the water, even now? Now, let's follow that thought a little deeper. If entire regions of land were swallowed by rising oceans, if coastlines moved, sometimes by hundreds of kilometers, then something very simple, but very important, must also be true. Whatever existed there is gone, hidden, not destroyed completely, but submerged. And this changes how we think about evidence, because when we search for the past, we usually look on land. We dig. We excavate. We analyze ruins, buried beneath soil and sand. But what if the most important pieces are not on land at all? What if they are beneath the ocean, covered by layers of sediment, water, and time? Take a slow breath and imagine the world again, 20,000 years ago. Sea levels much lower, continents larger. Shorelines extended far beyond what we see today. The Persian Gulf did not exist as we know it. Instead, it was a vast, fertile valley, fed by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, flowing further south into open land, a place rich with fresh water, vegetation, animals, a place where humans would naturally settle, live, build. And if any early form of organized culture existed, this would have been one of the best places for it to grow. Some researchers even call it the Gulf Oasis. Now imagine that valley, slowly filling with water, year after year, generation after generation, until everything is submerged. Villages, structures, paths, memories tied to the land, all of it beneath the surface. And here's the quiet part. We've barely explored it. Underwater archaeology is still a young field. Difficult, expensive, limited by technology. And yet, even with those limitations, there have already been discoveries. Off the coast of Japan, near Yonaguni Island, there is a massive underwater structure. Terraced, angular, almost architectural in appearance. Some say it's natural. Others are not so sure. In the Gulf of Cambay, off the coast of India, sonar scans revealed patterns on the seabed that resemble foundations, grids, possible remnants of something built. In the North Sea, in a region once known as Doggerland, fishermen have pulled up tools, bones, artifacts from a landscape that used to connect Britain to mainland Europe. A land now completely underwater. And these are just fragments, hints, small pieces of something much larger. Because if even a portion of human activity took place along ancient coastlines, then most of that record is no longer accessible. Not easily. Not yet. And that leads to a quiet, but powerful realization. The absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence. Sometimes, it's simply a matter of where we're looking. Now, let your thoughts slow again, because this doesn't prove anything on its own. It doesn't confirm lost civilizations, or rewrite history overnight. But it opens a door, a possibility, that what we know is only what remains above water, and what lies below may still be waiting. In the next part, we'll shift again, from oceans to stone, Because scattered across the world, there are structures that raise a different kind of question. Not where they are, but how they were built. Now, let's leave the oceans behind and turn toward something solid. Something that has survived time, erosion, and entire shifts of civilization. Stone. Because while wood rots and metal corrodes, stone remains. And across the world, there are structures made of stone that don't quite fit the timeline we've been given. Let's begin with a place in southeastern Turkey. A quiet hill, once dismissed as nothing more than a natural rise in the landscape, until excavations began, and what they uncovered changed everything. This place is known as Göbekli Tepe, and it is astonishing. Massive stone pillars, arranged in circles, some reaching over 5 meters in height, weighing up to 20 tons. Carefully carved, with detailed reliefs of animals, lions, snakes, birds, abstract symbols, and perhaps most striking of all, some of these pillars resemble human forms. Stylized, intentional, watching silently across thousands of years. Now here's the part that matters. Göbekli Tepe is over 11,000 years old. Older than Stonehenge. Older than the pyramids. Older than what we are told. Civilization itself. According to the standard model, people at that time were hunter-gatherers. Small groups. No cities. No writing. No large-scale organization. And yet, here stands a complex that would require planning, coordination, engineering. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of people working together, transporting massive stones, carving them, positioning them with precision, all without metal tools, without wheels, without what we would call a civilization. Pause there for a moment, because this creates a quiet tension, a contradiction. Either hunter-gatherers were capable of far more than we imagine, or something about the timeline is incomplete. And Göbekli Tepe is not alone. In Lebanon, at Baalbek, there are stone blocks weighing over 1,000 tons, not placed randomly, but fitted into a foundation. In Peru, at Sacsayhuaman, massive stones of irregular shape, cut and fitted together so precisely that not even a sheet of paper can pass between them. No mortar, no gaps, just perfect contact. In Bolivia, at Puma Punku, stones carved with such precision that they resemble machine work, clean angles, smooth surfaces, repeating patterns. In Egypt, the Great Sphinx shows signs of erosion that some researchers argue could only have been caused by prolonged exposure to heavy rainfall. Rainfall that hasn't existed in that region for thousands of years. And yet, there it stands, silent, watching. Now, let your mind rest on that pattern. Different continents, different cultures, different official histories, but similar questions. How were these structures built? With what tools? With what knowledge? And perhaps most importantly, when? Because dating stone is not simple. You can't use carbon dating on rock itself, only on organic material found nearby. Which means, if a structure was built long before later cultures occupied the site, we might only be dating the last people who used it, not the ones who built it. Like finding a modern object in an ancient building. and assuming the building is modern. A quiet mistake, easy to make, difficult to detect. Now take a slow breath, because we're not jumping to conclusions. We're not rewriting history in a single step. We're just observing. Patterns, questions, gaps between what we see and what we've been told. And when those gaps appear, something else often follows. Stories, not written in stone, but carried in memory. Passed from generation to generation. Stories that try to explain what came before. In the next part, we'll listen to those stories from different parts of the world, and you may begin to notice something that feels strangely familiar, as if everyone is remembering the same thing. Now, let's slow down again and listen. Not to stone, not to numbers, but to stories. Because long before history was written, it was spoken, passed from voice to voice, across generations, carried through time, not as data, but as memory. And when we begin to gather these stories from different parts of the world, something unusual happens. They begin to sound the same. Not identical, but familiar, recognizable, as if they all come from a shared origin. Let's begin with something simple. The idea of a first age, a beginning that was not like now. In ancient Greece, the poet Hesiod described it as the Golden Age, a time when humans lived like gods. No suffering, no labor, no war. The earth provided everything. Life was long, peaceful, complete. Then came decline, the Silver Age, the Bronze Age, each one a step further from perfection, until finally, the present age, imperfect, heavy, fragile. In India, the same idea appears, but even more structured. 4 great cycles of time called yugas. The first, Satya Yuga, an age of truth, harmony, long life, humans living for thousands of years. Then, slowly, each age becomes shorter, darker, more chaotic, until we arrive at the current age, Kali Yuga, an era of confusion, decay, and loss of knowledge. Now pause. Because we've already seen this pattern before, in the Sumerian king list, before the flood, long reigns, almost unimaginable durations. After the flood, shorter lives, shorter cycles, a gradual decline, different cultures, different languages, but the same structure, a perfect beginning, a fall, a fragmentation. Now let's go further, because in many of these traditions, there is something else, not just a lost age, but teachers, beings, who brought knowledge. In Mesopotamia, they were called the Apkallu, 7 sages, often described as emerging from the sea, bringing writing, science, law, civilization itself. In India, there are the Rishis, 7 great sages, preservers of sacred knowledge, guides through cycles of destruction. In Egypt, there are references to Zep-Tepi, the first time, when gods ruled the land and passed knowledge to humans. In Mesoamerica, the figure of Quetzalcoatl, a bringer of knowledge, a teacher, said to have come from across the sea, and one day return. In the Andes, Viracocha, a creator figure, appearing after a great flood, teaching survivors how to rebuild. Now just sit with that for a moment, because the pattern is becoming clearer. A world before, a catastrophe, a few who survive, and then teachers Figures who bring knowledge back, who restore what was lost, not inventing, but reminding. And over time, these figures change. They become gods, symbols, myths. But underneath, the structure remains. Now ask yourself something simple. Why would cultures with no contact, separated by oceans, repeat the same ideas, the same numbers, the same cycles, the same sequence of events? Coincidence? Perhaps. Shared human imagination? Maybe. Or something remembered, something so significant that even after thousands of years, even after language changed, even after details were lost, the core story remained. Now let your thoughts soften, because we are not forcing conclusions. We are not choosing belief. We are simply observing, listening, allowing patterns to reveal themselves. Because in the final part, we will bring everything together. The tablets, the numbers, the floods, the stones, the stories. And ask one quiet question. What if this is not the beginning of human civilization, but its continuation? Now, let everything slow down. No more fragments, no more separate ideas. Just one continuous picture. We began with a question. What if human civilization is far older than we believe? Not thousands of years, but hundreds of thousands. And along the way, we found pieces, scattered, uncertain on their own, but together, forming a pattern. The Sumerian tablets, speaking of kings who ruled for spans of time that feel impossible, yet written with structure, with intention, with mathematical precision. Not chaos, but memory, encoded in a language we no longer fully understand. Then, the flood. A quiet line in a text, but echoed across the entire world. A moment where everything ends, and something new begins. And then, the earth itself. Layers of sediment, ice cores, geological records, all pointing to periods of sudden change. Rising oceans, shifting climates, land disappearing beneath water. Not myth, but measurable reality. And then, the silence beneath the sea. Ancient coastlines, now gone. Valleys, now filled with water. Places where people would have lived, now beyond easy reach. Not erased completely, but hidden, waiting. And then, the stones. Structures that seem to exist outside the expected timeline. Göbekli Tepe, Baalbek, Sacsayhuaman, Pumapunku, the Sphinx. Each one raising the same quiet question. Not did they exist, but how and when. And finally, the stories. From every corner of the world. Golden ages, great floods, teachers who came after. Knowledge restored, not invented, but remembered. Now, let all of that settle. Gently. Because we're not here to prove, not here to convince, only to consider, to hold a possibility. What if human history is not a straight line, but a cycle? A rise, a fall, a forgetting, and a remembering. What if civilizations have emerged more than once, reached heights, and then disappeared, leaving behind only fragments, numbers on clay, stories in memory, stone in silence? And what if we are not the first to ask these questions, but simply the latest? Now, take a slow breath, because this thought can feel unsettling. If everything can be lost, then nothing is permanent. But there is another side to it. If knowledge has been lost before and found again, then nothing is truly gone. As long as something remains. A story, a symbol, a trace, a question. The chain continues, and you are part of that chain. Right now, in this quiet moment, as you listen, as your thoughts begin to drift, you are doing the same thing that humans have always done, trying to understand where you came from, trying to see beyond the visible, trying to connect the fragments. And maybe that is the real continuity. Not buildings, not empires, but curiosity itself. Now, let go of the need for answers. There is nothing you need to solve, nothing you need to decide. Just let the ideas fade, like ripples on still water. And as you drift towards sleep, imagine something simple. A shoreline long ago, where land meets water, where waves move slowly, in and out. And beneath those waves, hidden in silence, are the remains of worlds no one remembers. Cities without names, stories without voices, waiting, not to be proven, but to be wondered about. And far above, the stars move, just as they always have, watching, unchanging, as civilizations rise and fall and rise again. If you've made it this far, you've traveled, not just through history, but through possibility. And if something in this story stayed with you, something quiet, something unresolved, then let it stay. You don't need to hold on to it. It will remain somewhere in the background, like an echo. Now, rest. And if you choose to return, there will always be more to explore. More questions, more shadows, more fragments, waiting to be seen. Until next time, sleep well.